afternoon. Happy New Year, everybody. I'm very happy to introduce Omri Barak. Omri did his bachelor's in the Technion, then continued to do his MSc and PhD in Weizmann Institute with Misha Todix, then continued for a postdoc in New York with Larry Abbott and Uzi, right? And he's going to speak today about, I'm going to try an analogy from history, putting neurons, looking at neurons through the school of thought of the Anal, looking at the silent majority or the relatively silent majority rather than the heroes of what's going on, and trying to make sense of the population curves. I hope this analogy wasn't too far-fetched. Let's try.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for inviting me. And today I'm going to tell you about embracing disorder, making sense of complex population codes. And the general question I want to address is the nature of neural representation. How do neural representations look like, and why is it so? And this question, of course, was asked many times in the past and was often answered by considering the activity of single neurons linked to a sort of a reduced question of how does the activity of single neurons relate to things such as vision, cognition, or action. For instance, in the seminal work of Hubel and Wiesel, neurons in the primary visual area were probed with bars of given orientations, and they observed that when a bar of a particular orientation elicited many spikes, whereas a bar of a different orientation elicited little or no spikes, leading to a tuning curve that describes this single neuron as coding a given orientation. So this neuron can be described with a very nice and compact way. In a similar manner, neurons in the motor cortex were found that encode the direction of motion of a monkey's arm in this case. And when we come to cognition, working memory, then when people use the delayed saccade, so a monkey fixates in the center, a target briefly appears in the periphery, and after a delay period, the monkey has to saccade to the location of the memorized target. And depending on the location of this target, there are neurons that during this memory period fire preferentially to one direction and not others. So there are these examples of very impressive single neurons that have a very easily interpretable response profile. And the thing is that these order neurons are not the whole story. And we know that in the brain, large populations of neurons are responsible for our behavior, and no single neuron is in charge of too much, in a sense. And yet, we look for and are inspired by these impressive single neurons. And what I would like to do today is focus on the other neurons and show that the non-typical neurons, as we often call them, also carry information and are useful. And I would like to describe a few projects I did in this direction. So first, I would like to show that neural recordings are disordered, that this is not bad news, it is actually good news, and I have some methods of analyzing to understand this. And when I say disorder, it's somewhat of a vague term, and I will refer to many different types of disorder throughout the talk. For instance, the response can be a very nice function of the stimulus, or it can be something that can be roughly termed as disordered, or the response can be preferential to the same stimulus throughout time or throughout the duration of the trial, whereas another neuron can prefer one stimulus during a certain epoch or part of the trial and prefer a different stimulus in a different epoch of the trial. And the method I will use throughout the talk is to consider a population of neurons. They can be either from experimental data or from simulations, and then I will try to read out or decode information. I will do this using a linear readout, with the motivation being that the information has to be accessible, easily accessible, not just there. It has to be accessible to single neurons. And I will try to manipulate the representations in various ways to ask what type of representations are good to decode information. So first, neural recordings are disordered. To illustrate this point, I will use data from the laboratory of Ranulfo Romo, the delayed vibrotactile discrimination task, and recordings in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. So the task is as follows. A monkey sits with an extended finger. A mechanical probe is touching the finger, and then at a certain point, the probe vibrates with a given frequency, F1. Then there is a delay of a few seconds, after which the probe vibrates again with a frequency F2. The task of the monkey is to report, using a button press, whether the first frequency is larger than the second one. Now, when we think of how the brain might accomplish such a task, then several things immediately come to mind, that the system somehow has to encode an analog variable, let's say the first frequency, then it has to keep this variable in memory, and finally it has to do math. It has to subtract F2 from F1 in order to determine whether the first frequency is larger than the second one. With these expectations in mind, we look at the recordings and find single neurons that seem to make a lot of sense. So this is a single neuron, and on the x-axis we have time with the first stimulus, the delay period, the second stimulus, the y-axis is the firing rate, and each color is a different value of the first frequency, from a low stimulus frequency to a high stimulus frequency. And this neuron encodes in a positive monotonic manner the magnitude of the first stimulus and maintains such an encoding throughout the delay period. So we have here an encoding of an analog variable in a positive manner and maintenance in memory across time. All we need is now the math. It would be very useful if there was a minus neuron to complement it, and indeed there are such neurons. So these impressive single neurons, of course, lead people to construct models that use them and take inspiration from them. And one such model, for instance, has the positive, the plus neurons excite each other and inhibit the minus neurons and vice versa. And then the plus and minus neurons in the model have all the components I described with the example neurons before, and the model accomplishes the task. But of course, in this model, all the neurons look like this. In the data, they do not. So the data has neurons that are not exactly positive and not exactly negative, but are some combination. The data also has neurons that during the stimulus period have a minus, so they decrease firing rate with increasing stimulus frequency, but during the memory period, the delay period, they do the opposite. They are now plus neuron. And of course, you can say, okay, this is my typical neuron that I chose because it does this. But if I plot all neurons that have a significant tuning here and here, then the stimulus tuning and the delay tuning are very weakly correlated. So it seems the rule that things are not kept constant across time. And so to summarize this short section, there are ordered single neurons in the brain, and they tend to guide the models we build. But there are also other disordered neurons. And now I want to show you that this is not bad news. And to convince you of this, I would like to take a slightly different approach. And I would like to present a machine that was designed and engineered to track the location of people. And this is the machine. And its mode of operation is as follows. When a person steps in the forest, he leaves a footprint. And then I can come and look at the footprint and know where the person has been. But of course, this is not a machine that was designed to track people. It's a forest. It's just a complex physical system. And when somebody steps in the forest, he has no option but to leave a footprint. And the intuition from this type of consideration led people to construct models known as echo state or liquid state networks, where a neural circuit is also a complex physical system, and when a stimulus impinges upon this neural circuit, it has no option but to leave a trace, which we can later detect and read out. So In this framework, there is a network of neurons that are randomly connected. And random here means without any relation to the task at hand. So the connectivity here is not tuned in any manner to the task. And then there is a readout that tries to tries to extract the information from this network. So how do I implement this Romo task with such a network? I have to specify the input and the output. So the input is according to the stimulus protocol, and when the stimulus arrives, then every neuron, let's say this neuron here, has a certain input according to the stimulus frequency. Let's say this neuron here will receive a positive tuned input, and another neuron will receive negatively tuned input. And note that the connectivity between these neurons has nothing to do with the input they receive. It is completely random. And now, the readout will try to tell me whether F1 is larger than F2, and it will do so by producing this bump of activity for one answer and nothing for the other. So I trained the network using a force algorithm developed by Larry Abbott and David Sosilo, and the network learns the task. So when I present the network with F1 larger than F2, it responds with a bump of activity, and it does not when presented with the opposite frequency relationship. Now, the problem is that such networks, we know how to train the network, but once the network is trained, we usually do not know how it achieves this computation. And personally, at least, I found this a bit disturbing, that if I have a network in my computer that I cannot understand how it works, it's a bit pessimistic about the ability to understand the brain, which is what I'm really interested in. And when you look at the activity of single neurons in this network, it looks a bit like a mess, which is, of course, what the network was designed to be. It was designed to see how a disordered network can solve problems. And in this specific example, I was able to understand how the network solves this task. And to understand this, we have to consider what happens in the network as we provide the stimulus. So for a specific stimulus protocol, let's say a specific value of F1 and F2, this is the stimulus space, and there is also the neural space, let's say 1,000-dimensional space where every dimension corresponds to the activity of a given neuron. And I'm not very good at drawing 1,000 dimensions, so I'll only plot 3. But as the trial progresses, for a specific stimulus protocol, the network, the neural state, changes. And at the end of the second stimulus, it will reside somewhere. For a different stimulus protocol, then the network will take a different path and end up in a different place. And for every point in stimulus space, there is a corresponding point in neural space. So there is a 2D manifold in this neural space. And then the way the system solves this problem is actually not by doing math, but by consulting, let's say, a lookup table. So the network doesn't say 7 minus 3 equals 4, but it just says 7, 3, yes, 2, 5, no. And what the network has to do is basically draw this line between the positive and negative examples, which corresponds to drawing a line in the neural space. And then it means that dynamically the network has to push the points away from this line in neural space. And the way it does it, again in this specific example, is through a separatrix and a saddle point. And I will just very briefly say that in this example, I was able to also to locate this specific saddle point in a 1,000-dimensional space by performing a gradient descent on a scale on the norm of the dynamics. And since the dynamics is not symmetric, this is not an energy function. But if we happen to be, due to the stimulus, close enough to the hypothetical saddle point, then this gradient descent, again, which has nothing to do with the dynamics, might lead us, and did lead us in this case, to the saddle point. So if the network works by consulting this lookup table and does not do math, it will probably be very poor at generalizing.
Just understand, go back.
Yeah.
So this is separation is in the random network.
This separation...
Nothing is trained here.
No, so the network has this, the force algorithm has a feedback. So this part is trained, but the readout itself is fed back to the network, and then the overall dynamics does the readout is in a sense part of the dynamics.
What exactly is reinforced during training?
What you want to achieve is that you want to have the output match this form, and the way it is done basically is, one way to do it is to cut the loop, to open the loop, and to inject the desired output back into the network. And this does work, and so you inject the desired output and the desired input and train the network, the readout, to match the desired output. This works, but is not stable. So what is the force algorithm does that is stable is not cut the loop, but simply learn very fast, and then there is a very small error, so you explore the vicinity of the desired output, and then the stability is greatly increased.
What's changing during that learning process?
These weights, the red weights here, the readout weights, are the only thing that changes. So, if the network is doing a lookup table, then it will probably not be able to generalize, and that's a bit bothering because people do generalize. Then to study this, I tested the network, does it generalize? So I trained the network on this grid of stimulus protocols and tested it on new untrained examples. And when the generalization was in the form of interpolation, so it was within the trained range, but not the trained values, the network performed perfectly. When I tested it on extrapolation, then the network gradually began to fail. And instead of having this border, it had some other border between the two classes. And this was a bit alarming until I went to the psychophysics literature and saw that actually humans are not perfect at extrapolating either. So in this experiment, people were trained on a stimulus-response relationship that was either linear, exponential, or quadratic, and they were trained on the middle segment of each of these functions and tested on the entire range. And interpolation was perfect in all cases, and extrapolation was not perfect even in the linear case. So again, I'm not saying that this is... The task was to... a bar was shown on the screen. In the training phase, 2 bars were shown, one corresponding to stimulus, one corresponding to response. And this trained the relationship within the middle range. In the test phase, only the stimulus bar was shown, and the subject had to feel the response bar to indicate the magnitude of the response. So they were told there is an association between X and Y, and then we're going to teach you and then test you. So I'm not saying that this response is as bad as the network, but because there clearly is some extrapolation. But also extrapolation is clearly worse than interpolation. So there is something to the reliance on examples, and the inference of rules is not a perfect thing. Yes?
How do you see here interpolation?
So the samples that were tested here are not the ones that were used to train. So all of the test points are novel points, but the training range was inside here.
Excuse me.
Yes.
Clearly, if the formula function has some discontinuity, extrapolation would fail miserably.
Extrapolation actually is ill-defined. I mean, what is and yet when you expect people to realize that this is a linear relationship. Maybe it's a bad expectation, but again, people do not do randomly here completely. Right? There is some tendency, there is some inertia that people do pick up, but again, this is just to say that having a lookup table is not completely implausible. Finally, I can go back to this network that has a very strong random component and look for neurons that seem to make sense. Look for neurons that have a very ordered response profile, and when I look for them, I do find such neurons. But these neurons are rare, they arise by chance, and they contribute nothing to the dynamics of the network. So just having these neurons does not indicate the mechanism by which the network operates. Yes?
So could it be that a classifier is focusing on such neurons too?
No, so I know it's not. So to summarize this section, there are disordered neurons, and inherently disordered models can perform such a task, and the solution is qualitatively different yet plausible. And this, again, what this I want to emphasize here is that this is a different approach than taking a problem, saying how can we design a system that solves it, and then looking in the brain for components of the system that we think it should operate. The brain might have found a different solution. Maybe not this one, but maybe.
Can you explain what you mean by the difference?
So this does not. The network that had the plus minus really did math. It was designed to subtract the first frequency from the second one.
This is designed to solve the problem in different ways.
Yes.
So different
right.
design.
Yeah. It's. I think my claim is that the constraints on the mechanism are somewhat weaker here. It could be that in retrospect I could have foreseen that this is how the network would have solved. But for instance, when I first heard Larry describe this network, then he said, okay, the network solves it, and I do not know how it solves it. So clear that indicates there was no.
That's a different question, but then
How
fast we can understand the network is not a matter of principle between the two. Both of them are engineered to solve the problem.
Yes. Now I want to go one step further and say that this having disorder is actually good news. And to do that, I will look at a slightly different definition of disorder. What happens when you combine different information sources? For instance, you want to pick up the phone when it rings at your home, but not when it rings at a friend's home. So the one information source is whether the phone rings or not, and the other is whether you are home or not. And if we want to consider how a population of neurons can represent this, then one option is to represent this in an ordered fashion, where one neuron is in charge, only responds to the phone, and another neuron only responds to home. If I look at the activity of both neurons together, I can fully extract the information of which of the four conditions I'm in. Another option is a disordered representation, where each neuron mixes the two information sources, and again, if I consider both firing rates together, I can fully tell which of the four conditions I'm in. So now I would like to ask which one is the one we find in the brain, and whether there are some advantages to one of them. To do that, I will use data from the laboratory of Earl Miller in MIT, where monkeys were trained on a sequence memory task. So in this task, there is a sample sequence of two images, and on different blocks, it is tested in different manners, a recall and a recognition block. In the recall block, following the sample sequence, 3 images are displayed, and the monkey has to saccade in the order of the sample sequence. This is the recall block. In the recognition block, following the sample sequence, a test sequence is displayed, and the monkey has to report whether this is identical to the sample sequence. Overall, the task has 24 different conditions. There are 4 possibilities for the first cue, 3 for the second cue, and 2 block types. And we can again plot the activity of one of the neurons in prefrontal cortex, recorded here, to these 24 conditions. But of course, having 24 conditions, it's a bit hard to say whether this is an ordered or disordered neuron. So to answer this, again, we turn to a decoding framework, where we try to extract parameters of the task from single trials. And again, single trials are interesting both because they present us with noise that the brain has to deal with, since it only has access to, and because the brain has access to single trials. We do not have recordings of hundreds of neurons simultaneously, so we did what is known as a pseudo-simultaneous, where we randomly mix trials to create a virtual population, a virtual single trial from 230 neurons. And now we are going to decode the identity of the first Q from the population of neurons, and we see that we can perfectly decode this following, of course, the onset of the first Q. And at this point, of course, you might say, well, of course you can, because you have neurons in the population that are highly selective to the first Q. You are reading them and ignoring the rest. So to answer this, I'm going to remove or erase the selectivity of all neurons. So if I have a neuron that is selective to the identity of the first Q, it has an average firing rate that is higher for the first Q, for one QA than QB. I'm going to artificially equate the firing rates so that the firing rate for QB is the same as that for QA. And of course, for different combinations of another information source, QA and block type, there's still going to be some variability. So for the entire population, I'm going to erase the selectivity. So I now have a population of neurons that each one by itself is not selective to the identity of the first Q. And I'm going to read out from this population of non-selective neurons on a single trial basis, and I can still decode significantly above chance the identity of the first Q. Note, however, that most of the signal does seem to come from these selective neurons, but when the second Q appears, it seems like, and now the network has to encode more information in a sense, then the fraction, let's say, that comes from the mixed component is higher. But I would like to push this a bit further, and to do that, I'm going to introduce a new virtual task. So I'm going to ask the population of neuron, can I decode from the neural activity a task that was not the task the monkey had to do, but let's say a gating task. So in this virtual task, let's say that if the block type is 1, let's say recall, I'm ignoring the second stimulus and only base my decision on the first one. In the second type of block, Cognition, I'm going to ignore the first Q and only base my decision on the second Q. So in this task, again, I'm going to decode it from single trials, and I'm able to do this significantly above chance. And now there is no difference between the purely selective neurons, the neurons that are selective to this task, and the neurons that have just mixtures. So all the information seems to come from the mixture, and we can do this in a systematic manner where we try to train the network with more and more complex tasks and ask how many neurons do we need to implement such a task. And we can either do this with the real neurons that have some mixed component, or we can do this with purely selective neurons. And the purely selective neurons are neurons that through shuffling we artificially make them either selective to the first Q or to the second Q or to the block type, but not to mixtures. And we need many more of these purely selective or ordered neurons than to implement the same task that fewer real mixed neurons implement. And through some shuffling algorithm, we can extrapolate this beyond the number of neurons we actually have and see that the pure selective neurons saturate at a given complexity, while the mixed neurons can perform more and more complex tasks. So, yeah.
What is complexity?
So complexity here, there are 24 conditions, and I'm going to basically ask a classifier, for instance, I'm going to specify the output of 8 out of the 24 conditions and not care about the remaining 16 conditions. So this is a complexity 8. Complexity 24 is I'm going to specify all of them, and I'm going to ask, can you solve 90% out of the 2 to the 8 such problems that there are? So I'm going to specify the output for more and more task conditions.
So here things are limited by neural noise or by the representation?
So there is neural noise and there is also representation, and I will, the next section, I will try to provide a mathematical intuition for why this is so, why pure neurons are not as good as mixed neurons.
No, but without noise, maybe a single node can just do it.
So there is noise. There is single trial noise in both cases, and if there is no noise in this case, probably a single neuron can do this, because I'm going to explain in a second, but the reason it's hard to do is because of low dimensionality. And the real data, without noise, things will never be collinear. But with noise, they are, in a sense, collinear. That's the intuition of why it's important to consider noise.
In terms, what you're saying is the efficiency of random coding. When you have a random code, it's basically a coding key. So when you do random binning, you achieve the
It's not exactly, and I think it will be a bit clearer in a few slides. If it's not, ask me again, because the information is in both of them. It's just whether you can read out linearly or not. So coding, it's slightly different. Okay, so there are disordered representations again in this task as well. Mixed representations. We can decode task parameters from population of non-selective neurons, and these disordered or mixed representations support flexible tasks. And now I would like to know, through analysis, why. Why are the mixed neurons better? And the intuition behind this is the dimensionality in neural space. So if you have this ordered representation, every condition corresponds to a point in neural space. So this condition will be here. The next condition differs by only one coordinate, the next one by the other coordinate, and the next one by both coordinates, and they belong on a plane. Of course, I have two dimensions. They have to belong on a plane. But even if I had 1,000 neurons that each one of them only responded to the phone or only responded to the home, this would have been on a two-dimensional plane. Whereas a disordered representation causes for a higher dimensional neural space, neural representation. And the reason that I care about this is, again, the information is present in both types of representations. But if I have a low dimensionality, then there are some things that I can use a linear decoder to read out, and there are others that I cannot. And this was a bit artificial, this 2x2 example, and it shows this XOR problem. But in general, when I have many information sources with many types of information in each one of them, then, for instance, in the case in the Earl data, there are 6 dimensions and 24 conditions. So when you combine many information sources, there is a very low dimensionality compared to the number of conditions, which will always, or almost always, cause a problem of linear separability. And now, these mixed representations solve the problem of the low dimensionality. Yes.
So the previous slide, so roughly speaking, is the explanation that if you have n bits and if you only allow one out of the n bits, which would roughly correspond to your measuring from single neurons and whether they are active or not, as opposed to you are allowing all possible bits to be 0 or 1, in which case you have 2 to the power n number of possibilities, and is that why? I didn't quite. Is that roughly
why the dimension is low? Or
yeah.
So the reason the dimension is low is maybe the easiest. Can I use the? If you consider the inputs, to the classifier, and let's say there are 2 information sources, and then you have, let's say, n neurons from one information source. Maybe I'll do it a bit higher. there are going to be n neurons from one information source and n neurons from the other information source. And let's say there are going to be m possibilities for one of them and n possibilities for the other. Let's say m possibilities for the first Q and n possibilities for the second Q. So there are going to be m times n different conditions, but the way they're going to look is this is going to be, let's say, x1, and this is going to be y1, this is going to be x1 and y2, and so on. And this matrix has a rank of m plus n, minus 1 actually, but m times n conditions. So this the dimensionality is because of this structure, that you are, there's a very, very high correlation in a sense between the things, because you reuse twice or n times the same one information source where you only change the other one. So this is why you have a very low dimensionality. Whereas the mixed representation is a nonlinear transformation of this. So then you increase the dimensionality. Yes?
If I understand you correctly, there are two issues here. One is the mixing, and one is the noise.
Yes. Yes, exactly.
Representation is ugly.
Yes.
And in principle, the mixing is enough. So if you have the 24 neurons, each one corresponding to one category, then.
But there is noise. But I cannot ignore noise. There is no. The brain has to deal with noise, and actually the noise is crucial in this analysis because, again, I'm going to show it in a few slides. But basically, you want to remove this correlation, to pull the points apart, but if you do this too much, then you will increase noise too much, and you reduce performance. Maybe I'll try in a few slides, and if it's not clear, then ask me again. Okay, so the mixing, in principle, can solve this problem. So if I use these pure representations, order representations, there are some things I cannot do because of low dimensionality. Once I have this mixed representations, the dimensionality is higher, and I can extract the information with a linear classifier. But now, does it matter how I mix the information? Are some mixed representations better than others? And to ask this question, what I did is tested the classification accuracy with noisy inputs to see whether the performance of some mixed representation is better than others, and I derived a formula that links the form of the representation and the performance of the classifier. And I have to somehow define how I mix them, and the hypothesis is that random connectivity is sufficient. That if I have the two information sources and I randomly connect them, project them to a different layer, and with a simple threshold, that is sufficient to solve this problem, and the representations will be sufficient to perform adequately. And the parameter I used, again, to vary the representation and compare one type of representation to the other is the sparseness of this coding. So I changed the threshold of these neurons, thereby affecting the coding level or sparseness of the mixed representation and checking the effect this has on classification accuracy. And the result of this analysis is a formula that estimates the classification error or the test error of such a classifier. And what it basically has is two components. Is a signal component and a noise component. And again, the noise is very important here. So the intuition is this. Before mixing the neurons, I had a problem that was not linearly separable. And again, I have clouds of points here because I'm interested in this single trial or noisy type of data. And what I would like to do is pull them apart to a higher dimension. So the signal part is a measure of this nonlinearity, the nonlinearity of the transformation, how the mixed neurons, how nonlinear are they. But the noise is also important because once I try to pull them apart, I'm applying the same transformation to the entire space. I have no choice but to amplify noise. So there is some middle point where I where the discrimination is good. I can discriminate between the different classes, and generalization, knowing that different noisy versions belong to the same class. Both of them are balanced. But once I try to increase the signal too much, then discrimination in principle, let's say between the centers of these clouds may be better, but generalization is hurt. So the noise is amplified too much. And the threshold or sparseness modulates both of them to generate an optimal coding level or sparseness level that has the minimal classification error. Whereas again, if I'm too sparse, then it's as if I have no mixed representation at all, and I have this case of nonlinear separability. If I increase the coding level, then I have this optimal situation, and when I increase it too much, then I'm hurt by noise.
What do you think about
The
the noise?
noise is isotropic, or let's say, so the noise, I have a for each type of Q, I'm going to have a representation. This is going to be a plus minus one vector, or randomly chosen, and I'm going to present it with, let's say, 20% chance to flip any bit in the input, or some value. Just this figure was, I think, 20%. That's right.
In what sense this explanation is different from the classical literature of Babnik generalization rate? I mean, this is the theory he presented when he spoke about the generalization rate for vector machine, especially the balance between.
Okay, so this, I mean, first of all, this, formally, this is a support vector machine. You can say that there is an input layer, there is a kernel that I'm implementing by neurons here, and there is a readout from the kernel. Or you can say this is a two-layer network where I'm not training the first layer, but only training the second layer. But that, I mean, in a sense, I'm okay with this being a support vector machine. This is just a way to describe it. What I'm interested in is what type of representation do we find in the brain, and the fact that there is a noise here. For instance, I mean that this formula is specific for this case. So there is literature on support vector machine, but there is no literature on how to deal with such an input, which is, to my thinking, a relevant input for neuroscience, where you combine information sources. Okay, so I would like to say a few future directions and thoughts. First, that there is, to my thinking, this is a slightly different way of thinking, in the sense that the brain is a product of evolution, and then once, but once, in a sense, evolution is over, and now we have the brain, we hold it in our hand, and does the way the brain operates resemble a well-designed computer, or does it in itself resemble some selection mechanism, like the immune system or other biological systems? And I think there is, again, I agree with Chaim that my definition of an engineered or designed system may be a bit too narrow, but there is some tendency to try and think of a solution and then search for it in the brain, whereas the brain has much more freedom to find solutions. And in particular, for instance, should we look and search for fixed representations for every concept, or is this just a limitation of the way we think about how the brain should operate? And one more thing that I would like to stress, in this talk I took a rather extreme approach. I took a completely random network and random connectivity, and showed that I can do things with this completely random, unstructured networks. But first of all, an ordered system is better for the specific task it was designed to solve than a general random network that can do many things. So there is some trade-off between flexibility and performance or adaptation to a very specific network. And the way I think that we can tap onto this question is by using multiple timescales. And it doesn't have to be milliseconds of firing rate and the millions of years of evolution, but biophysics bestows upon us many timescales in the between. And the general notion is that the designed features of a fast system are merely the adapted properties of a slower system. And if we try and here I only studied a given fixed system that has no adapted or structured components whatsoever, but I think the interesting thing will be to study a system with more than one timescale, and then the statistics of the environment can affect the system, and in a sense begin with a random network and then learn some structure upon it that can make it a bit better in the type of tasks it has to deal with. And finally, the notions here, I think, are not unique to neuroscience. There are other systems, complex systems in biology, such as the immune system, or such as signal transduction networks where multiple sources of information interact, for instance here from receptors to second messengers to genes. And I hope that some of the analysis tools developed can apply also to these things. Finally, I would like to thank my collaborators, Ranulfo Romo, Larry Abbott, David Cecilo, and Misha Todiks were involved in the EcoState network, Stefano Fusi, Mattia Rigotti, and Earl Miller in the Miller data analysis, and Stefano Fusi and Mattia Rigotti in the mathematical analysis, my funding sources, and of course you for your attention.
I have a semi-philosophical question. Okay, if we consider the Romo experiment, there are two competing approaches. One would be Christian Machen's model saying that what you do is you compare two frequencies and just subtract, and your approach saying that you have a lookup table.
Yeah.
And so now we have a new. Ranulfo trained his monkeys on, 8 pairs of stimuli or something like this. And now we take a new pair. And before doing the experiment, we want to have prediction. So Christian would say, well, the monkey is comparing the two frequencies, and therefore if I give a new pair of frequencies, I already know what's going to happen. And what you would say, in particular if these frequencies are somewhat outside the range, you'd say, well, I have no clue what the monkey is going to do. I'm a chance there. And I think that in many cases, in particular for this task, but also for others, I think that Christian would be right. So the monkey did learn the rule. And you see it in many cases. For example, in the old Nishida experiments, when you have a delayed match to sample, monkeys can do it on completely new stimuli the first time. So
the two things. First of all, that's exactly what I thought of, and I started thinking about the problems with a specific experiment, that the Romo experiment has a flatter range, which was pretty much exhausted by the training protocol, so it's hard to have novel things. But then actually there were the psychophysical experiments that I showed that actually did this precise thing with humans, and extrapolation was not perfect. Again, as I said before, extrapolation was better than completely random. There was some rule learning, and there is rule learning. And I think I think
you are unfair here about extrapolation. So you can really do extrapolation for the linear case, and there it is almost perfect, and people cannot come up and we can discuss it later why there are these small discrepancies. For the other case as well, I mean, the fact that experimentalists had some rule in mind doesn't mean that this
I agree. I agree there is, I mean, the experiment of this extrapolation, and there are many other experiments in this body of literature, show that the behavior is a combination of rule-based and example-based. It is not purely rule-based. And I think, again,
the system is a rule-based, but a more complicated rule-based that we don't know.
Okay, but
a non-intuitive rule-based.
Okay.
Well, how do you distinguish between example-based, rule-based topic and random rule-based?
No, I'm saying that you can go a long way with an intuitive rule-based.
It's
from predicting the data point.
so there, but in a sense, the fact that people extrapolation is ill-defined. Strictly speaking, extrapolation is ill-defined. So once you do extrapolate, I can take an extreme view and say, well, obviously you did see some example of something that told you this is the way to extrapolate. So you did learn math, or you did something that taught you this. And in a sense, the whole life is an example-based learning.
But it's an empirical question, not semi-philosophical. I mean, you have prediction that it will be doing something completely crazy if you do extrapolation, and the question is, what is you show some data on humans, and one can ask about monkeys, but it's an empirical question.
It's an empirical question. It's a slightly I mean, there are many subtleties to this question, but it is an empirical question. And again, as the data showed, I don't think it will be completely random, but I also don't think it will be completely rule-based.
But the Lookup the model is not predicting the complete random behavior. There is some generalization they even.
No, but once you're far enough from the trained set, then you are actually if you're strictly careful, then it is not completely random, because the points correspond to some aspect of the neural dynamics. So there are other constraints that, for instance, if you give a very, very strong stimulus, you will probably saturate the network, and then it doesn't really matter what you do. The response will always be the same once the network is saturated. And in a mathematical abstraction of the lookup table with random behavior outside is not exact. So there are some constraints, and for instance, that's one direction that might be interesting to look, whether the exceptions to either rule or example based agree with the constraints that can be expected from neural dynamics. Yes.
How about thing so you have a random network. Now you erase 10% of the neurons. So in a random network, the dynamics of this network is completely changed, and all your learning would be completely irrelevant to the new situation that you have, because now the mapping is on a different level. It should have a different dynamic. While if you have like a representation that is in some way inside the network has some meaning, then it should probably increase the noise. It wouldn't change it, quality.
So it's in a sense it's a quantitative question, because the network, when you think of this random network, then the intuition, at least I had, was of some big mess that has a very, very precise and finely tuned path in neural space, and if you change one spike, then the readout is completely destroyed. But the fact that the network interpolated means that this is not really the case. So this two-dimensional manifold in neural space is, maybe it's like this, but it's not like this. So it's not, the transformation is, even though it's a dynamics of a random network, it's still continuous. Even this network, by the way, even when you take it to the chaotic regime, I can still train it to perform this task. So let's say the transformation of this two-dimensional stimulus manifold to neural space is at least much smoother than I expected. And I didn't try deleting 10% of the network, but it is more resistant to noise than you might expect from the word random that has this flags of noise. Yeah.
So I have a question also about this network, just to put some order into some of the questions that were asked about generalization. I just don't sure that I understand. I know what is the answer. Suppose that the task would be completely random. So you would choose the same pairs of frequencies, but for some of them it would be plus, for some minus, regardless of whether they're higher, the second one is higher or lower. Would your network perform as well if the frequencies are dense
No, it would probably fail. I mean, so again, if you train it on, if you ask it to train it on 20 examples, it will probably be okay because you have 1,000 neurons and 20 examples. But here the key thing is that you have in principle infinity of examples. Right? You have a plane of examples. And then the intuition is that if you take this plane, because the manifold is not too distorted, you can sort of span this plane by only a few samples, and then you have many fewer samples, then you have dimensions, and the perceptron will work. Or another way to say it is that if you have highly correlated inputs, then the capacity is not the same as that if you have again, if you have highly correlated inputs and the outputs are correlated also in the same manner, but if you have highly correlated inputs and the outputs are not correlated, then you will not be able to do this.
Okay.